Welcome. My name is Helen Liu, and I'm the Programming and Partnerships Manager at Cary Library. I want to thank you for joining us for our program tonight, Thoreau Knowing Nature. This program is brought to you by the Thoreau Society, who received a Mass Humanities Staffing Recovery Grant in support of their membership and program coordinator. Funding from the Mass Humanities has been provided through the Mass Cultural Council. This program is being recorded and will be posted to the library's YouTube channel. If you have any questions, please submit them to the Q&A and Zoe will answer them at the end of the program. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Zoë Pollak received her Ph.D. in English from Columbia University, where she focused on 19th century northeastern and pre-Harlem Renaissance nature poetry. She designs exhibits and interpretive materials for the Concord Free Public Library, the Robbins House Museum of Concord's African American History, Thoreau Farm, and the Thoreau Society. Her writing has appeared in places like ELH, ESQ, Now Comes Good Sailing, Writers Reflect on Henry David Thoreau, Princeton, and Women's Studies. Her 2024 essay, The Politics of Reverie in Olivia Ward Bush's Driftwood, published in Callaloo, was awarded the American Literature Society's 1921 Prize for Best Essay. Now please join me in welcoming Zoe.
Thank you so much, Helen. I really appreciate the kind introduction, and thank you very much to Cary Library in Lexington for hosting this presentation, and thank you all for being here tonight. This is a webinar, so I won't be able to see you, but I am definitely wanting to get your perspective, and there will be times throughout the presentation where I'd love to ask you to put some thoughts into the chat, and then there will be time at the end. So the presentation is about 45 minutes, and then there'll be 10 to 15 minutes at the end for questions and reflections. So definitely keep in mind anything you want to ask or offer. So thank you again for being here. So this presentation is called Henry David Thoreau, Knowing Nature, and it is completely fine if you've never read anything by Thoreau or if you've read like his entire body of work. That both are great, and this is really kind of more of so I'll be talking a little bit about Thoreau and his background and kind of trying to place him in context. I think for any mythic totemic figure, it can be hard to kind of remember that they were living, breathing people who interacted with other people and lived in a specific environment. So some of this presentation will be doing that, but some of it will also just really be looking at the way that he describes the natural world in his writing and looks really closely and really focuses beautifully and just so acutely on perception. And so I think that there can be a myth about Thoreau as somebody who wanted to escape into the woods, live in a cabin, and get away from human society. And some of what I'll be talking about is I'm going to try to complicate that myth a little bit and look at how he looks to the natural world, not to escape human society, but really to understand human cycles and seasons through natural ones. So I wanted to start by asking you all, if you wouldn't mind, in the chat, thinking a little bit about the plants and the trees that you grew up with and the place in which you grew up. So if you wouldn't mind sharing the plants and the trees and then the place that those trees and plants are from, and if you have any specific memories of childhood. And I know it can kind of take some time to write these out, so we can just start with plants and trees or just a very brief description, but I would love to hear your perspective on those things. I'll just wait for a minute in the chat. Okay, redwoods from the Bay Area, flowers in Central Park, eucalyptus trees in San Francisco, in the East Bay Hills, cattails by the Sudbury River, Queen Anne's Lace by the roadside, climbing the lychee and mango trees in India. What I remember best are the dogwood trees growing up in East Tennessee, birch trees in Finland, Joshua trees from Southwest Desert. Oh, that's great. This is like a real variety of plants and places, and very evocative, even just the names of these trees. So we're going to be thinking, Thoreau spent his life in the Northeast in Massachusetts. Some people are probably based in Massachusetts, some are not. But I just wanted to kind of have you all think throughout this presentation about the nature that you grew up with and that you interact with. Thoreau spent a lot of time walking through the woods and the natural world, and writing about it, but that doesn't mean that just because we're not, necessarily in the natural world for 4 or 5 hours a day, like he was, that we're not deeply and intimately connected to it and to the elements. So, let's see. So I wanted to think a little bit broadly to start about what it means to know a place. What does it mean to know an environment? And how do we get to know a place? So there's sight, sound, smell, touch, and other forms of direct experience. There's returning to a place in different times of day and different seasons. Maybe revisiting a place in memory, or perhaps by hearing about a place through other people's representations and recollections. And then there's seeing a place portrayed in art or photos or literature. So that's what I'm going to be focusing on, all of these things, but especially because Thoreau was a very beautiful writer on getting to know a place through writing. Whoops. Okay, so this slide is showing an image that was painted in 1885, around 1885, of Boston Common. It's by a child Hossam, and I'm showing this because, so I grew up in California, and I came to Massachusetts about a little over a year and a half ago, I think. And this was my impression of Massachusetts, where Thoreau was from. Boston isn't that far from Concord, where he lived and wrote, about 20 miles, which would have obviously, in his time with the railroad taken, well, I would say taken longer, but actually the same railroad that existed in his day exists now, and we can take that Fitchburg line to Boston. But anyway, so this image is an image that was on my grandmother's wall in California in the Bay Area. And she had spent time with her kids, my mom and her siblings, in Massachusetts. And so I'm imagining that she kind of wanted to take Massachusetts with her and have this very romantic image with her in the North. And so as a kid, I grew up looking at this, being about the age of the little girl feeding the birds in the snow, and thinking of Massachusetts in this way. Okay, whoops. So I'm just trying to get back to this. Okay, so, but I think really what made me feel entirely immersed in Massachusetts before I even arrived here was in Henry Thoreau's writing. So he has this way of perceiving and documenting what was going on in the world around him in a way that feels just so immersive and perceptive and detailed that I haven't encountered in any other writer, really. So I'm going to just read an example from a portion of Walden called The Pond in Winter. So Thoreau writes, "Like the water, the Walden ice seen near at hand has a green tint, but at a distance is beautifully blue, and you can easily tell it from the white ice of the river or the merely greenish ice of some ponds a quarter of a mile off. Sometimes one of those great cakes slips from the iceman's sled into the village street and lies there for a week like a great emerald, an object of interest to all passers. Perhaps the blue color of water and ice is due to the light and air they contain, and the most transparent is the bluest." So there are a lot of passages like these in his writing. I chose this one because at the time that I was composing this presentation, there was a lot of ice around, and there still is a lot of ice and snow, at least in Massachusetts, starting to melt. But I see here that Thoreau is writing, on the one hand, in a pretty scientific, detailed, almost empirical way, describing the tones and the textures of the ice in just a very finely observed way. But then, so like a scientist, he was, a naturalist. But then there's also a very artful way that he's using these metaphors, describing emeralds, likening ice cakes to emeralds, and that really rich blue and green color. So at the same time that he works like a scientist and in this kind of empirical way, he's also using these brilliant metaphors and figurative language to capture the world around him. So I think that that mix of poetic and philosophic and also just very scientific and precise is something that we can see throughout his writing and that makes it so memorable. So, okay, I wanted to ask everyone what comes to mind when you hear the name Henry Thoreau, and to just put that in the chat. It can be like a word, it can be a phrase, it can be a sentence, whatever. Walden. Okay, nature, birds, cabin. Those are all, yeah, I associate those with Thoreau too. Ralph Waldo Emerson. Great, yeah. Civil disobedience. Walden. Great. Thank you all for sharing those. So yeah, I think all of those come to my mind as well. And so we'll get into, oh, let's see. Okay. A writer who can sound argumentative at instances and lyric and reflective at others. Great. Great. Okay. So just keep all of those associations in mind. And I want to kind of just approach his image a little bit. So to kind of think about him in broad strokes. And a lot of what you brought up is actually in this slide. So you're thinking ahead of me. So Thoreau lived from 1817 to 1862. He was born and died in Concord, Massachusetts, and he died in the middle, or well, at the beginning of the Civil War, but when it was very much a fully fledged war. Let's see, he wrote across genre. So someone said civil disobedience, brought that up in the chat, that he's probably most famous for writing Walden and Civil Disobedience. So Civil Disobedience was a piece that he wrote when he was recounting the time that he refused to pay a poll tax to protest a government that supported slavery in this country. Somebody brought up Ralph Waldo Emerson. So Thoreau was mentored by and friends with Emerson, who also lived in Concord. There was this group of like very brilliant writers and thinkers who lived around this time and who are kind of referred to as transcendentalists, or what a lot of historians refer to as a transcendentalist literary period, philosophical period, and political movement. So another person who probably a lot of us read in high school is Nathaniel Hawthorne, The Scarlet Letter. He's connected to this group. They had these utopian communities that they tried out. Some of them failed, but they thought a lot about what community, individual volition, especially during the time of slavery when, well, what am I trying to say? I'm going to move on from that. So, because I don't want to get behind, but Thoreau was an abolitionist. So he was the brother and son of a mother and sisters who were extremely involved in protesting slavery. So we really think of Thoreau as associated with civil disobedience, and there's an essay, Slavery in Massachusetts, but he would not have, I don't think he would have been able to write these pieces, at least in the same way, without being informed by his mother, who helped found the Concord Female Anti-Slavery Society, and his sisters who took part in the society. His sister Helen was vice president of the society and actually a friend and correspondent of Frederick Douglass. The Thoreau family their house in Concord formed part of the Underground Railroad, which was a network of safe houses and places that people who were fleeing slavery would shelter in as they escaped north into Canada. So he was very much involved in the abolitionist movement and writing about it. So, and then in the chat, someone wrote that he was lyric, but also argumentative. So, yeah, he tried on a lot of different personae in his writing. And so you'll see like at some points, it's almost paradoxical because he's this amazing observer and listener. And there's a whole section in Walden called Sounds, where he's just really listening to the world around him, to the sounds the birds make, the trees make, and the people in town. And then he also can really be argumentative and just kind of declarative. So he's both of those things, and I think it's a good reminder to remember that writers are trying on different voices and personae when they're writing, and so it's hard to know what he was actually like as a living, breathing person. Um, so he was also a naturalist. So I'll talk about this in a little bit, but he spent a lot of time walking through the woods and collecting botanical specimens, and those specimens that he collected and these records that he kept of cycles and changes in nature continue to inform climate science today. And he was a worker as well. So he was a pencil maker. His dad and his uncle had a pencil factory, and we have them to thank for the number two pencil, which is kind of a cool trivia fact. And people think that actually his time that he spent in the pencil factory, he was inhaling these pencil shavings, and he ultimately died of tuberculosis. And we think that that was worsened when he was, inhaling these shavings when he was younger. He was also a surveyor, so he would walk around measuring the dimensions of land masses, farms, bodies of water around him. So that was part of why he was walking around in the world, although he wrote to just kind of have time to think as well. So I want to just try to dispel a few myths that I've at least heard, surrounding Thoreau and that I was introduced to when I first learned about him in California, not having been to Massachusetts, but I've also talked to people in the Northeast who have been told similar things, that he was a hermit, and that he really, was not a fan of society and wanted to just kind of be more than not just a solitary, but kind of a curmudgeon. And so I just wanted to show a couple of passages. And then this, I think that this is a really interesting piece of art. If people are in Massachusetts, it's at the DeCordova Museum in Lincoln, and it's a fairly new piece by a contemporary artist who wants to literally push on or see the cabin at Walden at a slant. It's called Huff and a Puff. And if you're able to get there, you can see that there's a reflection in the window of the cabin. And if you stand in front of it, you can see yourself, but it's kind of at a distorted angle. So it definitely involves the viewer. So Thoreau writes in Walden, "I am naturally no hermit." And then he dispels this myth from the very beginning. And then he writes also that he every day or two would stroll to the village to hear some of the gossip, which is incessantly going on there, and which, taken in homeopathic doses, was really as refreshing in its way as the rustle of leaves and the peeping of frogs. I really love that quote. And I think it shows that he wasn't trying to escape to nature to avoid human concerns in society, but that the two are really, that he puts them right next to each other, the rustle of the leaves and the peeping of the frogs, and a way of thinking about human cycles, mortality, human dreams and wishes, to kind of, he looked at those and thought about those when he was in the natural world, and makes a lot of comparisons to beings in nature and plants and their own cycles. So he was immersed in the world around him. I mentioned before very briefly that he was a surveyor. So I just thought that this was kind of an interesting, if you look at the bottom, you can see that there's this advertisement for his surveying, and you can see it says areas warranted accurate within almost any degree of exactness, and the variation of the compass given so that the lines can be run again. So he captured the world in many different ways with his pen. So there was the surveying that he did, and then there was also his writing. So this is a couple of pages from his journal. He kept a really voluminous journal that was about 2 million words, which, if we think about that, that's 7,000 to 8,000 pages, which is impressive. And that's not, he wrote all these other essays and lectures and books. So he was really prolific. And I chose this image, or this image from his journal, because there's an actual doodle or sketch that he drew of a feather that he observed when he was walking. And so I'll just read a little bit from the quote. So he's looking at this feather, and he's noticing that the feather is handsomely barred or watered with dark brown in an irregular manner. somewhat is above. So again, these like very empirical scientific observations. But then he says such natural objects have suggested the watered figures or colors in the arts. Few mortals ever look down on the tail coverts of a young hen hawk, yet these are not only beautiful, but of a peculiar beauty, being differently marked and colored from those of the old bird. Thus she finishes her works above men's sight. So like the quote from an earlier slide with the ice, where he's describing the ice very carefully and studiously, and then also using these beautiful metaphors to capture it in a different way, we can see here that he's comparing feathers to watercolors, and then also noting at the same time these very detailed details about them. So at the same time that we get that scientific kind of very closely observed way of capturing the natural world, we get these reminders that that humans are seeing them, and seeing them, that there's an artfulness to nature. And so the birds are artful, and then he also is an artist himself with his own pen. So Thoreau also so when he walked in the natural world, he would bring, and I think, so he would bring his hat with him. He and his sister would walk in the woods around Concord, and he would collect specimens, both of them would, of plants and of different leaves and flowers, and he would put them in his hat, which I think is a kind of, it's very memorable, and I think it helps me at least think of Thoreau as an idiosyncratic person. It's hard to remember when there's somebody who's been so mythologized, but this kind of quirky thing that he would do where a lot of people would collect specimens in the century, and people of a certain class, and press them in books that are called herbaria. And so this was to just document the world around them. Emily Dickinson, the poet who was living in Massachusetts and Amherst around the same time, did this. There's another poet, Frederick Goddard Tuckerman, who wrote sonnets about the natural world, and he had a chance to travel to England and visit John Keats's grave, and so he brought back a sprig of a plant from the grave and pressed it into a book. So it's kind of a mix of scientific and personal. And so Thoreau did this, he and his sister. And so he writes about, I think that my hat is about as good a botany box as I could have, and far more convenient. And there is something in the darkness and the vapors that arise from the head, at least if you take a bath, which preserves flowers through a long walk. So yeah, just imagining this person collecting these plants in his hat, again, I just think it's very memorable. And I also want to make the point that his sister, Sophia, she was a really brilliant botanist and is sadly, because she's a woman, written out of history for the most part. But she would go with him, and throughout his journal, we can see passages. And I have a link to his journal at the end of this presentation. I'll show it because we can all just go online and look. The whole journal is online, which is really, really cool. And you can just go to the day, like February 27th or something, if you want to see what he wrote on February 27th in the 1850s. But so his sister, he talks about often, would find plants that he wasn't able to find, that she would make these really brilliant observations. She was also an artist and created watercolors. And that image of the cabin at Walden that you can see, in the Thoreau Society logo, actually, but in first editions of Walden, is based on an image that his sister drew. So she was really talented herself. So the observations that Thoreau and his sister made about the world around them in the herbarium, and then also just in keeping records of seasonal changes over time, really has informed climate science and continues to do so. So this is a photo on the left of the lesser purple fringed orchid in the wild or in the forest. And then on the right is what it looks like pressed into Thoreau's herbarium. And a lot of these images are at Harvard. And you can actually, if you go online, you can look at, there's a Flickr site of like about 650 photos from the herbarium, which is kind of nice. But so this plant, which was abundant in Thoreau's time, is now locally in decline. So there was a really interesting exhibit at the Harvard Natural History Museum that called In Search of Thoreau's Flowers, an exploration of change and loss, that documented how his own observations and botanical specimens that he collected and wrote about can inform the way that we look at climate change and actually document it. So thanks to Thoreau and his sister, we know that that spring occurs around 2 weeks earlier in the Northeast than it did in his day. So in the latter part of this presentation, I kind of wanted to just think about, so we know that Thoreau was immersed in nature, documenting it, writing about it in poetic and naturalist ways. I wanted to think about what he might have been thinking about and the context in which he was writing and walking. And so it's always impossible to know what somebody was thinking who lived before we did, or even the person next to you. But I kind of wanted to just provide some context. So Thoreau writes in this essay, Walking, that I am alarmed when it happens that I have walked a mile into the woods bodily without getting there in spirit. In my afternoon walk, I would fain forget all my morning occupations and my obligations to society. But it sometimes happens that I cannot easily shake off the village. The thought of some work will run in my head, and I am not where my body is. I am out of my senses. In my walks, I would fain return to my senses. So I think this quote is striking because Thoreau wrote about this way before the iPhone was developed, way before computers. But he writes about this distraction that I think probably a lot of us can relate to. I also think that, yes, Katie says, walking into the woods bodily without getting there in spirit is unfortunately highly relatable. Totally. So I think it's interesting to keep that in mind, and also to remember that just because Thoreau is, he's one of the most well-known nature writers of the country, that doesn't mean that he was just always focused on the world around him. And he struggled just like we do with trying to center himself and to connect, to put his mind back in his head and be in the moment and to take in the world around him and not just be drifting off to other things or consumed by other things. So where might his mind have been wandering while he walked? So there are three kinds of large topics that I want to consider, and this is necessarily reduced because this is a short presentation, but I wanted to think about developments in technology that were happening at this time, slavery, which was happening at this time, and then personal loss and death that Thoreau was dealing with. And I think all of these were informing the way that he walked through the world. So to start with developments in technology. So at the time that a couple of years before Thoreau moved to Walden in 1843, the Fitchburg Railroad was being laid down by largely Irish immigrants. And so the development of the railroad was a huge, the industrial revolutions in the US and the UK, changing the way that people related to the passage of time, how quickly they could see each other, the telegraph wire and the telegraph being created, allowing messages to be conveyed from place to place. Really, I feel like I've heard people say that technology is developing really rapidly now, but I feel like, I don't know, when I think of what Thoreau and his contemporaries were living through, I feel like that would have been just really earth-shattering. So I took this quote from his journal where he describes the telegraph wire, the sound of the wind, kind of creating like a harp-like sound going through these wires. So I bolded some words because I think that it's really interesting to see the mixture of emotions and tones that he evokes. So the telegraph harp sounds strongly. I hear it working terribly within. It's as if you entered some world-famous cathedral resounding to some vast organ. The fibers of all things have their tension, strained like the strings of a lyre. He feels the ground tremble. The wire vibrates with great power, as if it would strain and rend the wood. And then no danger that worms will attack this wood. Such vibrating music would thrill them to death. So on the one hand, we have terrible tension, strain, death, great power. And then we also have a harp, a cathedral, thrill. So it's a really, I think that it captures the way somebody would approach a novel, something that's novel that he doesn't quite know how to think about yet, because it's this new development that is changing the world around him. And the poet Emily Dickinson, both Thoreau and Dickinson wrote about the development of the railroad in similar ways. So they described it, Thoreau describes the railroad that would go through Concord that he could hear very audibly in Walden. So he wasn't separate from the world, from the human world in Walden. He could hear the railroad all the time. And he wrote about it as like a fire-breathing dragon that's kind of a godlike figure, but then also horrible and terrible. And Dickinson, in a poem, also talks about how the railroad creates this horrid hooting stanza, which she's playing on the stanza of the poem, and the sound she creates in the poem, but then it's also the speaker of the poem likes to hear it at the same time. So I think that ambivalence is really striking and interesting to think about, that at this time that Thoreau was trying to center himself in the world around him, that he was hearing these new sounds, communicating, seeing how these developments in technology change the way that we communicate with each other. I'm going to go back one. So at the same time that developments in technology were happening, there were millions of people who were enslaved, and Thoreau, across the US, Thoreau was very much aware of this. I do want to say that when Thoreau was writing, slavery was officially abolished in Massachusetts. It was abolished in 1783, technically. But it's important to, I think, keep in mind that there was a fugitive slave law that was enacted in 1850. So that meant that the Underground Railroad was very necessary for people who were escaping because, and this was happening in Massachusetts, and Thoreau, again, was involved in this and his family. So just because slavery was officially abolished doesn't mean that there was slavery all over. And let's see, just want to add one thing to this. So, and Massachusetts benefited very much from the slave economy when Thoreau was alive. So Concord and Massachusetts in general profited from, so there were cotton mills. Well, there were mills that got cotton from the South, from plantations picked by enslaved people. There was tobacco, like just all of these goods that people were benefiting from in Massachusetts were directly connected to the slave economy. So this was happening at the time that Thoreau was writing. He writes, I chose this quote because, well, I'll read it. So this is from his journal. It's remarkable what a curse seems to attach to any place which has long been inhabited by man. It would be fit that the tobacco plant should spring up on the house site, aye, on the grave, of almost every householder in Concord. These vile weeds are sown by vile men. What obscene and poisonous weeds, think you, will mark the site of a slave state? So here Thoreau is using, again, thinking about the natural world and plants that we might not necessarily think of as connected to any human context, as a way of implicating Massachusetts and the North and the hypocrisy of declaring freedom or celebrating freedom from England and the colonies when putting millions of people in chains on its own soil. So Thoreau pointed out in various essays that he wrote, slavery in Massachusetts is one and civil disobedience is another, how people in Massachusetts would kind of think, and on the Northeast in general, slavery is part of the South, we're not connected to it, we're removed from it, we're unblemished, when that was very much not the case. And there were actually dozens of people in the small town of Concord who were enslaved. And the next slide I'm gonna talk about that a little bit. So, and throughout Massachusetts, but this presentation is focusing more on Concord, where Thoreau was. So again, just to put Thoreau in a little bit of more context and to try to not to see him as living and writing in a vacuum. So this image is a carte de visite of Jack or John Garrison, who was born, he lived a really long life. He was born in 1768 and was enslaved in New Jersey and fled to Concord and died there in 1860. So he was living at the time in Concord when Thoreau, he was about 50 years older, but because he lived so long, they were living at the same time and overlapped by decades. And so Thoreau writes about how his mom, so Jack Garrison, worked for the Thoreau family and boarded in one of their houses in a house that they lived in. They didn't have many houses at once, but they moved a lot. So he recounts, and again, thinking about relating to a place through memory, he writes in his journal, "It began snowing yesterday afternoon, and it is still snowing this forenoon. Mother remembers the cold Friday very well. She lived in the house where I was born. The people in the kitchen, Jack Garrison, Esther, and a Hardy girl, drew up close to the fire, but the dishes which the Hardy girl was washing froze as fast as she washed them close to the fire." So I just think that this is such an evocative memory that Thoreau doesn't have himself, but that clearly marked him and stayed with him. And so Jack Garrison, again, with I don't know who Esther was, I've tried to find out, and a Hardy girl. I'm assuming they were either friends or relatives, or they were, maids or worked in the kitchen. But just these people huddling together, and Jack Garrison being one of them. So Garrison was married to a woman who was the only known Black member of the Concord Female Anti-Slavery Society, a founding member, which Thoreau's mother and sisters were also a part of. So Thoreau's would have known, his mom would have known Jack Garrison's wife, well, at least in the context of this anti-slavery society. And Jack Garrison's daughter, who was a contemporary of Thoreau's, was an early civil rights activist and really brilliant teacher who I'm going to now talk about in this slide. So Ellen Garrison Jackson was born in 1823, which is just 5 to 6 years after Thoreau. So they were contemporaries. She grew up and went to school in Concord and in Boston, and she was writing. Well, we have letters. There are letters of hers that are unpublished that about 100 that document her experience. So she and some other women from Concord, but the Northeast in general, Black and white women, young women, wanted to go to teach during the Reconstruction period after slavery, after the Civil War, recently freed people. So she writes about this experience in these letters. And so this is a quote from one of those letters. So she writes, "I have a great desire to go and labor among the freedmen of the South. I think it is our duty as a people to spend our lives in trying to elevate our own race. Who can feel for us if we do not feel for ourselves? I feel as though there is much work to be done, and I would like to do my share." So this photo, she's not in this photo, but this is just kind of a period photo. But this is just to make clear that Thoreau was not just writing about slavery and its effects in a vacuum, but was around people and interacting with people who had experienced it, who were enslaved themselves or descended from people who were enslaved. So I would also recommend Ellen Garrison so if you visit the Robbins house, either if you're in Massachusetts, I would highly recommend this, or the website. It's a historic house museum that lay my cards on the table I work for. So I want to give it a plug. But if you want to learn more about Ellen Garrison or her father or her brother or her mother or her whole family, there was a network of people and activists. Definitely check out this website. Garrison also, about 100 years before Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat for a white passenger in Montgomery, Ellen Garrison tried to desegregate an all-white waiting room in a train station and was physically shoved out of it. So she writes about this. She's not very well known, but again, just like a very, very fascinating and intrepid person. So the third aspect of what I wanted to think about, maybe what was on Thoreau's mind or just in his milieu as he was walking, is personal loss. So these are two images, one of his brother, a portrait of his brother who died when he was 27 of lockjaw. He cut himself shaving and got tetanus, and he died very suddenly. And I think that I've read that he actually died in Thoreau's arms, and Thoreau and his brother were very close. They both taught school together. And one of the reasons actually that Thoreau went to Walden was to write a book, that A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers, that reflects on this trip that he took boating with his brother. And so it was kind of a way of having a writer's retreat and to think about loss and the loss of his brother and to mourn his brother. So at the same time that this happened, within 2 weeks, Emerson, so Thoreau's friend and mentor, Emerson's son, Waldo, died of scarlet fever. He, uh, sorry, forgot that. I thought I put my phone on airplane mode, but again, speaking of technology. So at the same time, within 2 weeks, Emerson's son died of scarlet fever. And so Thoreau wrote to Emerson, was facing his brother's own death. Both were, 27 and 4 or 5. Again, I think that it's at this time when Thoreau was living, it was much more common for people to get these diseases or sicknesses very suddenly. And so I think people had a different perception of mortality and of not being able to take one's longevity for granted. Emily Dickinson writes about this a lot. So I just wanted to quote from this letter that Thoreau wrote to Emerson, where again, he invokes nature to kind of think about human loss and cycles and regeneration in the world when there's so much, it feels like so much loss in one's life. So I think this is a really beautiful letter. He writes, "Every blade in the field, every leaf in the forest lays down its life and its season as beautifully as it was taken up. It is the pastime of a full quarter of the year. Dead trees, sere leaves, dried grass, and herbs, are not these a good part of our life?" And then he writes, "Death is the law of new life." So again, just a way of kind of thinking about the natural world and those cycles that one can take for granted in a way that, the grass will grow again, the blossoms will form on the trees each year, even if a human life won't come back, but just kind of being realistic about that, but then also taking consolation or finding solace in the fact that the elements will outlast us and connect us. So let's see. Okay, so this is the second to last slide. In kind of connection to personal loss, I wanted to think a little bit more about loss more philosophically, specifically related to, well, just the passage of time that okay, well, so let me rewind a little bit. So in Walden, Thoreau has a section called Former Visitors, Former Inhabitants. It's a really evocative section of Walden, which I would highly recommend. And so in this section, he writes about all the people who lived in Walden before he did. So I think that well, I at least grew up thinking that Thoreau was, on his own in Walden, one of the first people to build a cabin there and live there, and that is definitely not the case. And if there's time in the Q&A, I'm happy to talk about this. I have a great section from this book called Black Walden by Elise Lemire, where she talks about how there was a whole community of people who lived in Walden who were essentially pushed out to live in Walden. It was hard to grow crops on. So Black people who lived in Walden, descendants of formerly enslaved people, there were Irish immigrants. So just a mix of people. And Thoreau elegizes these people in a kind of romantic way. Like I think of the poet William Wordsworth and these romantic poets writing about ruins of homes and nature kind of overgrowing them, but trying to think about lives that happened or that went on before one's own, and marking and trying to trace those in what's left behind in the natural world. So Thoreau writes, "East of my bean field, across the road, lived Cato Ingraham, slave of Duncan Ingraham. Cato's half-obliterated cellar hole still remains, though known to few, being concealed from the traveler by a fringe of pines." And then Zilpha, a colored woman, had her little house where she spun linen for the townsfolk. She had a loud and notable voice. At length, in the War of 1812, her dwelling was set on fire by English soldiers. I have seen bricks amid the old copse there. So Zilpha or Zilpa, which is technically her name, but he kind of gets it wrong in Walden, had a hut had a cabin in Walden before Thoreau did, and she lived there alone for very different reasons than Thoreau was living there, but he was not the first person to do this. And these are, again, memories that he's recounting. He wasn't alive in 1812, but he would hear these stories and anecdotes from people in Concord, people he grew up with, people in his family. So he also remembers, so Brister's Hill, which is named after Brister Freeman, who was enslaved, but ultimately earned his freedom and fought in the, I think he fought in the Revolutionary War, and so he named himself Freeman. And so Thoreau remembers, there where grow still the apple trees which Brister planted and tended, large old trees now, but their fruit still wild and ciderish to my taste. So, and then he remembers an Irishman who lived there before him as well, who tragically died a couple of months, I think, after Thoreau got there. So I want to leave room for Q&A. I just have one last slide. But I did just want to kind of point out the elegiac tone here and how he's looking to the natural world to both relate to people who lived before him, but then also acknowledge the passage of time that separates them. So I'm going to just be quick about this, but this is Thoreau's, one of his most recent biographers, Laura Walls, writing about how for Thoreau, his response to the world is always to inquire about relationships. His point of interest is somewhere between the object and himself, and he critiques scientists for ignoring the between and dealing solely with the objects. So Thoreau asks constantly about relationships between things. And I just wanted to end on that because even amidst the loss and the oppression and these, I mean, I think this presentation definitely addresses some really horrifying developments and occurrences in human history. But I also think that Thoreau, in his writings, he wants to establish relationships between species, between plants and people, between other people who are mysteries to themselves and to others. And so he uses the natural world and ways of thinking about, again, seasons and cycles in nature to think about relationships between the way that we all experience time. We're all mortal. And so that connects our experience. And there's something, again, about the elements that outlast us that can be really affirmative. And I would definitely recommend looking at his writing because he writes about this a lot. So thank you so much for listening. And I definitely want to take time for questions and reflections, anything you want to add. If you want to, we only have about, I think we have like 10 or 12 minutes. So I wanted to provide my email in case anybody wants to get in touch and talk about anything that you heard or thought about in the presentation if we don't get time. And definitely check out the Thoreau Society for more talks like this and programs. So thank you again. And lastly, this is, and I apologize for the really small font, but just some reading recommendations that I thought I would provide for people. Feel free to, yeah, like if I saw somebody once taking a photo with a phone or like a screenshot, but these are texts that are, some of them are by Thoreau, but some of them are just kind of, they help contextualize his time, or just are about issues that I brought up in this presentation. And then you can see his manuscripts, his journals, his collected botanical specimens. These are websites that provide links to those. So thank you again. Okay, so I'm looking at go for the Q&A. Okay. Okay. So Kim Hester Williams says, you began, oh, let's see. But then Kim also says, I feel like this last slide. Okay, well, I'm going to read the question anyway. So you began by framing Thoreau's attachment and connections to an activity within the abolitionist movement, especially the influence his mother, who was prominent in the movement. Could you say more about how slavery and anti-slavery informed his environmental practice and writings? And then to clarify, I'm referring specifically to the nature observation and writing. Is there a direct relation between nature and abolition? Oh, that's such a great question. Yeah, I wanna think about, so I think, thank you, Kim, for those really thoughtful questions and observations. I'm gonna go back to a slide. Let's see. And yeah, so going back to this passage from, well, these passages from Former Inhabitants, I think that there's something, again, like part of what I wanted to think about in this hour with you all is how Thoreau turns to the natural world not to escape human relationships. And there's definitely like looking at the tobacco plant or looking at, so he remarks on Brister Freeman's these apple trees that Brister Freeman planted that still during Thoreau's day grew after Freeman had died. Um, I think that there, if you go now to Walden, there are apple trees that people have since planted to kind of honor Brister Freeman, but they're not, the actual, like so many of the trees were just felled and cut down in the last century. But I think that's a really interesting question thinking about. I think um, I put Camille Dungy's Black Nature, this collection of poetry on the reading recommendations, because I think she makes this argument that we tend to separate, and other scholars have done this as well and writers, but we tend to separate politics and race from the way we think about the natural world or portray it. And I think that Thoreau, let's see, just, oh yeah, thank you. So I think that this passage, even the simple passage, which looks at these apple trees that Brister Freeman had planted, something that like apple trees are such a biblical, I mean, like they're so, I'm trying to think of I mean, they're literally, yeah, biblical, but these associations that they might seem very benign or just very general. And then he connects it to this person who, is no longer there, who was enslaved, who he was one of the first Black people in Concord and to own his own property, and really relates these trees that have outlasted this man, and to kind of memorialize this person. So I think that there's kind of there's a political argument there. I wanna think about, I had another thing in my mind, but I think that just generally, when we look to Thoreau's nature writing, it becomes really clear that he that nature is just, it's not cordoned off from society, from culture, from politics. And I think that's really interesting and useful. And so it's not like he was just going to Walden to kind of have a like a beautiful haven from what was happening in the world, and to escape from concerns about human lives, people he knew, or slavery or war that was happening around him and in the country. And that he when he's in Walden and when he's in the woods and in the away from town, he's still seeing these relationships and these conflicts in the world around him. And so he takes, yeah, he's not trying to escape from them, and he prevents his readers from being able to escape from those concerns as well. Any Thank you again, Kim. Any other, let's see. Oh, let's see. Okay, see. Okay, so Sophia says, thank you. Let's see. Thank you for this beautiful presentation. Thank you, Sophia. How has reading Thoreau changed any aspect of your personal relationship to nature? What do you discuss as knowing nature? Oh, that's a great question. Thank you. I think that reading Thoreau has maybe made me see the world around me in a more, or observe it. I think that it's been like a meditative exercise, or like almost a challenge and exercise, that like reading Thoreau, I feel like I see the world he's describing more clearly in my mind when I read him. But I also think that when I'm walking in the world, or like for me growing up in California, a lot of the plants that Thoreau described for much of my life, I didn't really know much about. I mean, northeastern varieties of those plants. And now that I'm in that area, I feel like I appreciate details in the world that I might not have otherwise, that seem quotidian, that are easy to overlook, that he really honors in his writing. So I would say maybe I'm just hopefully a little bit better of an observer and an appreciator. I know that sounds a little bit pat. But yeah, I'll think more about that though. Thank you. And I think there's maybe time for one more question. Or I can just read um people's comments. So Anne Goldman writes, interesting that these elegies connect in some way with a surveying practice, through a surveying practice. But here it is a map of the past and its people, and they're still in some way part of the world of Walden Pond through which Thoreau walks. Definitely. And then Katie DiNatale writes, it's interesting to reflect on the perception of nature writing generally, and Thoreau specifically as escapist. Perhaps we are the ones who are trying to escape, or are perhaps missing sociopolitical context that would have been more apparent to a contemporary reader. I think that's a really great point. Really great point. And yeah, I think that like we've created, or like historiography has created this idea of an ideal of Thoreau as separate, going to Walden in this kind of heroic way. And if people have heard of Christopher McCandless, who went to Alaska to try to like escape capitalism and lived there, and tragically died. He didn't know how to, I mean, he got sick from eating like a poison berry or something. But these people think, like, we think of Thoreau as, yeah, I think we're doing that. We're separating him. We're creating that divide between culture and nature, when it was really a lot more subtle and sophisticated in the way Thoreau portrays it. And he writes throughout Walden, yeah, he was always going into town. So when people say like, oh, his mom did his laundry and he's really a hypocrite, like he addresses that head on. I mean, he never claims to not be connecting those two worlds. So okay, Abhai asks, are there guided walks around Walden? That's okay. Please send me an email and I can tell you more about that. There are some guided walks, the National Park Service. Yeah, there's not much time, so I'm going to, but please just yeah, send me an email. I'm gonna write an email here. Everybody can see that. There are a couple more questions. I would love to be able to talk with people about those. I think we're almost done. So I do really encourage you to send me an email. I would love to hear your thoughts. And thank you all for your time and for being here.
Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation, Zoe. I just wanted to mention to those who saw the Huff and Puff House that the Carey Library does have museum passes, so you can borrow one if you live in Lexington. If you don't live in Lexington, you can check with your local library and inquire about their library pass program so you can go see that house. The other thing I just want to ask, Zoe, is if you would be able to forward me that slide that has the reading suggestions. That way I can include it in the recap when I send the link to the recording for everyone who wants to rewatch this presentation again.
Definitely will do, Helen. And thank you so much for all of your help and for organizing this and for making sure everything ran smoothly.
Of course. Thank you again, and thank you all for joining us. Have a
Good
good
night,
night.
everyone.